So what is the role of a group financial controller or a group finance director, and should you be hiring one at this point in your business? Today we'll dive into what the responsibilities are of that role, what value they can bring, and I'm basing it on my experience when I've been in that role in different businesses. And so you can take something from that and decide if it's something that you're looking for in your business and get someone for it, or maybe it's a resource that you don't need and you can find alternative resources for your business. So let's dive right into it. So what is the group financial controller or a finance director? Essentially, this is the person that looks after your finance department. Now, they look after a lot of things that flow into this. And I'll go through a few examples of some of the areas that they need to look after and where they can bring value. A good area to start with that this person looks after would be the governance and policies. So essentially what that entails would be the policies that run the business. So for example, the treasury policies, you're determining when you can refinance as a business, especially for some businesses that are, investor funded or that are listed. They need to determine what the processes are when they do refinance and who's involved in that process. And you need to have a policy in place. And so this financial director or this financial controller would be overseeing all these processes. You also have processes around other external stakeholders. So let's say auditors, for example. What determines how auditors get their work? What other work are they covering in the business? Is it just audit work, or they also have other work like advisory that they have to do in the business? And this has to be documented in a process that is clear and transparent to everyone. You also have processes around key areas of judgment in the business. And these are areas where you don't really have technical guidance, but you want to show and you want to be transparent to other people how you are accounting for these areas. So good examples of areas like these would be areas, let's say, where you have provisions or estimations of what certain costs will be in the future. There's not really good guidance that you can get from the standards, but you can document what your policy is and what you use to determine what those numbers should be. So there's all sorts of policies in the business when it comes to finance policies, but that is one area that individual or that role can look after. So another area that I looked at and that this role can look at would be the financial environment of the business. So this covers the controls that are put in place and that environment in itself, whether it's documented or not. Essentially, you're making sure that there is no room for access that is not authorized into this environment. So whether it's your systems, whether it's access to documentation, so you have good controls in place. And so this finance director or financial controller will make sure that they're reviewing each and every process in your business to make sure that that environment is strong. You're also looking at this environment for audit purposes, because then that is going to be the leverage that you need to say you have a good environment and people can rely on the numbers being produced from that environment. So the controls and the framework and making sure that all that's documented is important and would be covered by that role typically. Then another important area would be financial reporting and tax. And so this is the preparation of the financial statements. So either the financial statements of your company or group financial statements, in other words, the consolidated financial statements of the group. So they may not prepare the financial statements on their own, and you may have maybe a group accountant or a reporting manager that does that, but overall they are responsible and they have to review all of this information to make sure that it's accurate and that it is compliant with the accounting standards and what the authorities are expecting to find in the financial statements. This also includes the tax. So what is being submitted to HMRC as a company in terms of VAT, in terms of corporation tax, or all other claims that are going through from a tax perspective. So they're looking at tax policies as well, which would have been included in the governance again. But you're looking at tax policies, you're looking at the tax numbers that are submitted. And so while there may be a tax manager or a tax accountant in your business, the finance director or the group financial controller will also be looking after this area to make sure that it is accurate. You're also going to have stakeholder reporting. So when I was in the role, I'd have to speak to audit committees. So usually if you're a listed business or if you're quite large, you have another committee or another board that sits on top of your group to make sure that information is being produced accurately, the entity is being run smoothly and in the way that it's supposed to from a governance perspective. And so there will be the audit committee, and essentially they work alongside the auditors of the business to make sure that everything is solid. So you would have to, or this person would have to, report to the audit committee to say, this is what has happened in the business, these have been the areas that have had challenges in the business, and also how the audits are going, which they will also get an audit report from the auditors on that. This role also covers team management and project management. So you're essentially looking after a finance department. So you're going to make sure that you are covering the recruitment of all the roles in that department. Sometimes you do have to sit in the interviews, or whether it's at first stage or second stage, you have to sit into the interviews and hire the right people for the right role. So you're looking after the department, the efficiency, the effectiveness of the roles within that department, and whether or not an additional role is needed in that department. So it's also determining where resources are needed. In some cases, maybe it may not be recruitment of people, but it may be outsourcing of certain services to professional bodies. So let's say, for example, you don't want to hire a tax accountant or a tax manager. You can go to a tax firm and they can provide those services. And so your finance director really looks at what's beneficial for your business, whether from a cost perspective or maybe from a resource perspective, what works best for you. And so that's something that that role covers as well. And then in other businesses, that role looks after the budgeting process as well. So every business that wants to be successful and is looking to scale would have a budgeting process or a forecasting process. Now, this process obviously works alongside treasury, and you'd be working with the person would be working with people in the treasury team. But essentially, you're looking at the outlook or the cash outlook of the business. What does it look like in the next 4 weeks? What does it look like in the next 12 months, 2 years, and long-term forecasts as far as 5 years out? Now, these forecasts are needed to determine whether the business will be viable in a few years' time and where the business will have shortfalls. So you might be a profitable business, for example, but it doesn't mean you're always going to have cash. So there's always cash cycles. Sometimes you have to pay your suppliers or your creditors, and sometimes the timing of when you get cash in from your customers does not align with that cycle. So you need to determine whether you'll be drawing down, let's say, on an overdraft, or you have to manage your payment cycles to make sure that all of this aligns. And so that forecasting is relevant and is looked after by this role. Now, this would include, very detailed information around maybe how the forecast should be rolling and be kept up to date. I've talked about that in some of my videos, but essentially they're just making sure that everything is up to date in terms of what the cash is today and where we will be based on what's happening and the arrangements in place as well. So as a group person, let's say a group financial controller or group financial director, they are looking at more than one entity. So it can be subsidiaries in other countries, and so they have to consolidate all of this that I've talked about. Or it can be different entities in the same country, so in the same, in the UK here, and they have to look at all the consolidated information. Where it's not a group, or where you're not operating as a group and it's just one entity, then it will just be for that particular company and there is no need for consolidations. Now, consolidations bring on a secondary level of work because there is technical accounting that goes on in the background, sometimes treasury, sometimes if it's in different jurisdictions, you're looking at foreign exchange contracts as well. And so your finance director or your financial controller has to look at all of these transactions and how that plays and is reported to the different stakeholders in the business. So how much does it actually cost for you to hire this person? Now, it's going to depend on the size of the business, the complexity of the business, and the location as well. So for larger businesses, you can imagine the workload is also a lot more, and it means the cost will be higher. Whether you break it down into 2 different roles and maybe split the work, or have it under one person and give them more, that is something that you have to determine from an operational perspective. But essentially, you have to look at all of these different factors before you decide what the relative cost would be. You can look at the market rates as well, and they can give you a good indication. Now, typically in the UK, for a fairly sized business, you're looking at anything from about £80,000, maybe £70,000 to about £200,000, depending on the size of the business and what they are looking after as well. Like, are they looking at different jurisdictions and who they are reporting into? So is this a cost that you can afford in your business? Or if you can't afford it, what are the alternatives? Now, should you hire one or not based on that? So I'd look at the cost, which is what I've just talked about, but also think about the progression. Ideally, someone in this role is someone who wants to progress in their career or in whatever they're doing. And so is there room for them to progress in your business? What other opportunities can you give them? What exposure do they have? And is there anything valuable that they can learn from your business? Some businesses offer mentorship or coaching programs, or sometimes with the direct manager or direct line manager, and so it helps them grow and they want to stay in that business. If you don't have room for progression, especially for candidates like this, they likely won't stay long, because they want somewhere where they are stimulated and something is new every day. Not essentially every day, but they are experiencing new areas of the business or talking to different people or contributing in places where they feel like they're giving value. So if you want to hire for this role, you just want to make sure that there is room for progression. Now, how do you find a good candidate? Now, like most employers, you're going to look at, recruiters or job boards, maybe where you can post your role. But if you don't want to get applications from people that are not really qualified, you want to work with maybe a specialist recruiter. There are some recruiters that only look at senior finance execs, and they can help you find this particular person. They'll bring you maybe a couple of CVs. I'm sure, as you know, because you've hired in your business, if you're considering getting someone at such a senior level. But you can speak to a specialist recruiter rather than a generic recruiter, because they're not just trying to fit anyone in finance. They're looking for someone who's had that particular experience, maybe for your particular industry, and tailor to the exact needs that you have in your business. You can also think about some contacts that you have in your circle. So the other networks that you're in, or other people in your similar position, or business owners, for example, do they know of anyone that they've worked with them that might be interested in this role? Likely they might be, and they can recommend someone. You can also think about hiring a resource that's not necessarily permanent, and maybe they can be a contractor. So with contractors, you're likely to get people that can do this role, and you can find them at short notice. The downside is they're not really usually invested in your business as much, because they're thinking of the next role and the next role and the next role. Again, I generalize, it's not everyone, but maybe I would go for someone more permanent for such a senior role, unless if it's just short term. Let's say you've lost someone who's gone for maternity leave, for example, then yes, you can get someone in the short term basis. In terms of qualifications and experience, I'd look at someone who's looked at managing people, multiple people. So they've had a team of at least 3 or more people, preferably people who are not in the same line of work, so that they know exactly how certain flows or certain functions flow into their role. So in this role, like I said, you've got tax, you've got treasury, you've got accounting or financial reporting. You may also have the forecasting process if it's separate from treasury. You may have other operating businesses that are flowing into or reporting into your area. So another example, let's say if you have outsourced, let's say transactional reporting, that area may be reporting into your finance director or your financial controller. So you want someone who has managed people in different lines of work, and they know how to have an overview picture or a good picture of the different functions and make them work together really well. You also want someone who has experience in finance. So maybe from a controls perspective, they know exactly how to spot gaps in a process document, or how to spot gaps in a process environment. Ideally, maybe it's someone coming from an audit background, because they know exactly how, or maybe they know quickly how to spot these gaps. So you might want to consider someone like that. They don't always have to have come from an audit background, but you want them to have that expertise of spotting things quickly. You also want someone who's good at documenting things, because they're going to be documenting papers to senior stakeholders. So they do papers on some of the processes or reviewing documentation that's done by their team, but they're also doing technical papers on accounting work to auditors. They're also doing papers to the board. They're doing papers to the audit committee where they report on how the business is functioning. So someone who has good writing skills can communicate things well in person and on paper, and can communicate concepts and technical fundamentals on paper as well. You also maybe want someone who knows how to interact with different people and different areas of the business, because as a finance team or as a finance director, they will be reporting and working alongside other operations. So for example, they may be working with the ops director or the marketing director. How are they going to work together if they don't know how to communicate? And so someone who can bring down all these terms to a simpler term that other people who are not in finance can understand. Someone who can also convert reports or financial reports that are usable for other people that are not in finance and that are easy to use. So someone who has good communication skills, someone who can interact and enjoys that interaction. Finance people are usually known to want to keep in their corner and just be, keep to themselves. But as they start to progress, they have to be people that are good at interacting with other people as well. Another thing you want is maybe as a quality, have someone who knows how to train people. So they're training people in their team, but also training people outside their team about how certain things should be done. So what policies they have, how the policies should be implemented. So a good example is maybe talking to people in HR or in payroll. They're going to show them how maybe VAT should be captured for mileage in your business. That's a finance area, tax, VAT, and it's being communicated to people that are outside finance, so HR, payroll, for example. Or it can be to ops team, how certain reports should be run, or certain numbers should be captured into the system to make sure that you're all saying the same message and everything is consistent. So those are some of the qualifications I'd look for and some of the experiences I'd look for. But if you get someone who's maybe a specialist, you don't need to look at that. They can do it for you, and you just review and sit in on interviews and make sure you're recruiting someone who's also a good fit for your culture in your business. So I hope that was helpful. And if you have any more questions about what that role looks like or how to get good candidates for that role, I'd be happy to help. Thanks for watching.